Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michelle Maloney, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to our webinar today. Today, we're looking at how paying attention to rocks can save the world with a wonderful artist and very good friend of mine, Marian Drew, and a new friend, an amazing geologist and creative type, Clive Willman. But before we kick off with their lovely discussion, I'd like to share screen and tell you all about Earth Laws Month and also acknowledge countries. So please bear with me. There we go. So first, I'd like to acknowledge that I live, work and play on the beautiful Yagara Turrbal country here in North Brisbane. I'd like to acknowledge elders past and present and the emerging young leaders and established leaders who are caring for country and caring for each other. I always like to acknowledge the remarkable governance system and civilizational culture that has cared for the country and the people across this continent since time immemorial. I also like to acknowledge the ongoing impacts and legacy of colonization and the work that my organizations Ayla, the New Economy Network Australia, NENA, and Future Dreaming try to do to play a part in decolonizing our hearts and minds and to make sure that we all care for this place and love this continent and care for each other. As part of the work that we've been doing inside the Australian Earth Laws Alliance, we've been celebrating humanity's relationship with the living world throughout September. We unilaterally declared September to be Earth Laws Month. And we've had, I think at the end of the month, we'll have clocked up something like 34 or 35 online events. Maybe by next year, we'll be able to do a whole lot of on-the-ground projects too. But we're really grateful to all of you for joining us. I can see a number of friendly faces and folks who've been with us throughout some of our events and also some new folks too. So you'll see that this is the page for Earth Laws Month. You can see the beautiful program of activities. We've had law and governance talks. We've had sessions with First Nations leaders. We've had economics, sciences, education, sessions about the Green Prince program, and some really fantastic arts and creative discussions. And that's how today's session sort of fits in, a lovely meeting point of the natural sciences, the arts, creativity, and love of place. And I guess all I'll say is we are in our final week of events. Hooray! And we've still got heaps more to come. So I just wanted to show you all that's the program for Earth Laws Month. And we have a beautiful, beautiful Earth Arts website, which I'm just showing you now. So the Ayla Earth Arts program is really important to us. Ayla believes that nurturing the role of creativity and inspiration within human beings is critical to transforming law and governance and really connecting us to love of place and love of each other. So I'd invite you all at your own leisure to have a look at our Earth Arts website. And a huge, fabulous thank you to James Lee for looking after and curating this beautiful website. And we've got the beginnings of our 2022 virtual gallery. The theme for this year is tipping points. And we've still got a number of artists who'll be sharing their material on this virtual gallery. It's really important to us that although we have no funding for our arts program, at least we can promote the artists who are part of our Earth Arts Collective. And on Thursday, if you're interested, we have a small 1-hour event launching this year's anthology, Earthwords and Artlings, which is all about tipping points. So that's enough by way of my endless commercial. But I do hope you'll visit the websites and respect and honour the remarkable work of many of the artists who are connected to Ayla's work, but primarily doing their own amazing practices. So that's enough from me. What I'd like to do now is introduce Marian and Clive very briefly, and then I'll let them introduce themselves to you with more detail. Marian Drew is a world-renowned photographer and an amazing creative, and she works with us inside the Ayla space whenever she has time to help curate our Earth Arts Collective, which is something like 15 artists now who come together. And pre-COVID, we used to do really beautiful art exhibitions in Brisbane, and we used to facilitate some regional activities as well. And Marian's work is just delightful, so I can't wait to see what she's been up to and what she's going to talk to us about. Clive Willman is a geologist with a creative flair and a whole bunch of amazing things that he has done. And Clive is a new friend to Ayla, and we're very grateful to him for sharing his time with us today. So you guys have a yarn for as long as you wish. And then when you're ready, you just call on me and we'll open up for Q&A. So thanks very much. And thank you, all of you, for being with us today. It really means a lot to us. Over to you, Marian.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Michelle. Thanks for inviting both of us. I'm very excited to share some of our work with everybody and to talk about things that I hope will be interesting to the audience, but I know it's going to be interesting even just for me. So I'm an artist. I've been working for about 40 years now, mainly in photography. I've been teaching at the Queensland College of Art, and now I've retired from that and I'm just working on my practice and doing a PhD. I've got a lot of slides we're going to show some of Clive's artwork and some of mine. And we might start off. I'll just ask Clive to quickly introduce himself just so that, and then we'll lead on to the first slide.
Thanks, Marion. Yes, my name's Clive Willman. I've been a geologist for, let me think, 42 years. Seems a long time. And I've spent half of that time in the Government Geological Survey of Victoria and the other half in exploring for gold, which I'm still doing at the present day. I've really just dabbled in the arts a little bit, and which I'll talk a bit more about later. But over the last 17 years, I got really interested in making films. So mainly they're of a technical variety, but occasionally I made a film about an artist and a bookbinder. So that is the main focus of my creative activity today, in the present day, although I've done some drawings in the past. Over to you.
Beautiful. I've been watching some of your videos, and hopefully we could put a link to those through the Ayla website, because they're really engaging, and I think you have great ability to be able to communicate these ideas to people. So thank you for that. I'll share screen now and go to our some of our pictures, which then you won't have to just look at our faces. So I've started off, this is a slide that I've picked up off the internet, which is what we do these days. And it shows its country where Clive is, because Clive's in Castlemaine and I'm in Brisbane, and this is Mount Alexander. So perhaps Clive is a way of sort of introducing where you are. I was thinking, as a geologist, you must see things very differently than the common person when you walk around these landscapes. How does it feel to you, and what does it mean to, when you come across a marine fossil on top of a mountain?
Well, I don't think you ever get used to the wonderment that you feel when you find evidence of ancient life. But I mean, in terms of actually looking at the landscape as a geologist, it's a bit like learning another language. I've learned the language of I've learned one of the languages of the landscape, and so it's a bit like reading the text of a foreign language. You might know a few words here and there, but unless you know the language well, you find it hard to decipher the deeper meaning. And in this case, it's trying to understand the origins of the land. But I mean, back to fossils, the fossils that I've mainly dealt with are in the range of 440 to 480 million years old. And when we find these fossils, we're really using them just to date the strata of the rock. And initially when we find something, we think, oh, great, this is another piece.
You're coming.
Another piece of the jigsaw puzzle. But that excitement of revealing something that has never been seen before, or an evidence of ancient life, is always there.
Mm. Mm. You were using your country, around where you live to. I'm just trying to make this artwork that I had the privilege to see when I visited you in Castlemaine. And at first it looks like quite an abstract drawing, but then on closer inspection you start to see that there's a logic behind these marks. Could you tell us a little bit about, I'll run through a couple of these as well so people can see as you're speaking, but could you tell us about how you arrived at this drawing?
Well, there was some friends of mine decided to put an art exhibition together. And this is in 2005, and there's some quite well-known artists invited to be part of this exhibition. People like Robert Jackson, John Woolsey, and Peter Churcher and others, Julie Goff. And they deliberately invited two people who were non-artists to contribute something. There was a dentist called Ben Keith and myself as a geologist. And so I had this, talk about no pressure with the caliber of artists in this exhibition. But one day I met Julie Goff, who's an Indigenous artist from Tasmania, and we were walking through the bush in Castlemaine, and she was describing what she was going to do, which was mark out shape of a leaf on the ground with stones, mainly quartz. That was one of the things she was going to do. And it occurred to me that I'd actually already created my artwork, because so the image that you see in front of you, they're actually upturned sandstone layers that were formed horizontally on the seafloor but have been upturned. And they actually, you can trace these through the bush. So that image there, that might be, I don't know, about 4 or 5 kilometers wide. So it is actually a map. But normally, when you put these on a geological map, you have roads, you have streams, you have all the human infrastructure. So I thought, well, I'll just take away all those other elements, the roads, streams, contours, and just show the sandstone bands themselves, because they're really interesting shapes. But I didn't make any of this up. This is reality. And so I felt that it was a way of revealing the skeletal structure of the earth, the bones of the earth, if you like. And I called it previous places because these layers were once horizontal layers on the seafloor that formed the seabed. So, even though if we're sitting in this area today, we call it the place Castlemaine, but once it was at the bottom of the Paleo-Pacific Ocean. It was a different place. And then they became uplifted and formed a mountain range, so it became a different place. So you can see what I'm getting at there is that there's this constancy. These sandstone bands were the constant feature that links us with almost a 500 million year history.
Exactly. And I mean, this drawing, in a sense, you'd sort of created something that had never been seen before because of that sort of separation and because of that perspective that you were able to bring. And it's come from a consequence rather than something, fabricated. It's got that huge sense of time and scale that, that I think, that's what sort of excites me about well, your work and even thinking about geology is that completely new perspective that it brings to, you know, how we see ourselves and our place, you know, in time and space on Earth, you know. And the work is about what scale is the picture? That's the whole picture there.
Actually, I meant to go out and actually measure it, but
just roughly, it's
roughly about 4 kilometres wide and I don't know, 8 kilometres high.
Right.
So, but the drawing itself, so it's a scale of 1 to 10,000. So it'd be 40 centimetres wide and 80 centimetres high.
Yeah. Right.
And so, I mean, people might be interested. See, there's about a fifth of the way down from the top. There's a sort of a gap there.
Yeah.
And the gap is there because that's where one of the major streams, Forest Creek, runs through the landscape. And there's a lot of infrastructure, railway lines and so on. And the rocks are simply not well exposed there. Whereas the area, the bulk of the image towards the bottom end, it's very, very hilly country. And so these sandstone layers are really, they're sticking out and they're actually controlling the shapes of the hills. But now I'm becoming too much like a geologist.
Well, I think that, I mean, no, that's a really important kind of bit of information, you know, that gives you a different view on the work. What was I was going to say, you know, it's a very, this kind of macro perspective really does, you know, shift the things. I mean, first of all, it reminded me of, you know, like scratches or bark or something organic or something cellular. But, you know, and I don't think there's coincidence that, you know, are, you know, by chance, there are these correlations and, you know, in people, there's an ambiguity, isn't there, when people look at an artwork and if they don't have you there to, you know, explain everything about it, you know, they have to sort of work at, you know, deriving meaning from artwork. And I suppose that's quite the different thing between the sciences and the arts, is that there is often that ambiguity and that it does rely a lot on what the viewer brings to their understanding of the work, you know, and how much effort they want to, you know, to give to that understanding.
Yes, well, I think it is a big difference between science and art. I think there are many parallels because we're both, you know, it's like, you know, I was talking about the language of the landscape. Well, you know, there's an artistic language, there's a scientific language, but I think, you know, the scientist wants to probe deeply and needs to express things in words and maybe, whereas the artist doesn't always want to over intellectualize.
Yeah. Although there is a lot of intellectualizing that goes on sort of behind, but then I suppose we're not aiming for an intellectual, a purely intellectual engagement. Is it? It's sort of like there's an emotional affect sort of engagement. That's right. And
well, that's right. Yeah. And I think, you know, that's what I realized when I finally got the idea of that this would be my contribution to this exhibition, that something that was purely scientific actually had an emotional content when you strip away all the other bits.
That's right. And you think of you walking, you know, hundreds of kilometers mapping this detail, and then you could see the detail, you know, you sort of zoom in and you can zoom in and zoom in, and there's just more and more kind of detail in, you know, in the delicate kind of hand markings. Well,
that's right. And you talk about scale, and I think, scale is really important in geology. I mean, you're looking at you're looking at the fabric of a rock. I mean, I could pick up a piece of that sandstone, and I could tell part of its history just by looking at a tiny bit under a hand lens. But to understand the whole history, you need to look at it at this macro scale as well. So we're constantly dealing with these different scales. Now, is that something that you find in your artwork?
Yeah, actually. I mean, scale, I might just move on to one of mine, actually. And because scale is super important, not only in terms of my thinking about the world and then trying to bring that back into a kind of a human space, but with photography is very much concerned with, time and scale, which have, synergies with geology. We're always reducing things back to these small, flat pieces of paper. And, people have learned how to read these, translations of the world, this three-dimensional kind of one perspective view. And, we read it as if it's a real kind of representation, and yet it's really is a incredibly abstract kind of view when you think about how we move through the world in time, and we have dynamic bodies, we have two eyes, and everything is sort of linked up. But photography kind of objectifies this and reduces everything to a sort of an equitable, comparable scale, which has been a great advantage. I suppose that's part of its uses that it's that it has been put to. But so I'll talk about this work. Particularly was as a series of works I made a couple of years ago after I'd visited the Kimberley, and which is Western Australia was really the place that ignited my fascination, love of rocks. And this is a piece of a Devonian rock that I photographically lifted from a cave in Tunnel Creek, so the water had sort of smoothed this Devonian rock and revealed all of this sort of meaty history, or the life that went into composing this rock. Then it was then compressed and metamorphosed over time to sort of form this sort of hard marble-like kind of limestone. And so I've felt that I was trying, I suppose, with these works was to, put them back into a familiar place, and, like the tablecloth, so, people's dining rooms, and, maybe make the correlation of that, the sort of the life that formed the rock. But also it's it's quite a surreal notion to sort of lift something and put it in this very different context. We don't usually see rocks on tablecloths, for example. So I think I was also very interested in that idea of estrangement, where it's familiar but sort of feels sort of wrong, a bit uncanny. It's a sort of surrealist, device that helps, I hope, that people to sort of like see things in a different way, see what might be quite familiar in one context, and then in another it becomes like a whole new object. And this idea of scale, I mean, this was basically a mountain that I photographed, sort of mapping it on site, and then I brought it back as a number of files, and then relocated it onto another rock which I had put onto the tablecloth, so that it appears to be sort of positioned and sitting on this. But you can feel that there's something wrong about that location and about the way it's sitting and the weight of this thing, and the types of the way it's formed. And then I made a print of like a star background out of focus to, you know, make that connection, I suppose, between, you know, rocks on Earth and the universe, and, you know, that they're basically made of the same material. And I'll show you another one, hopefully. It doesn't want to go forward. It's weird. I'll just go this way. And these, yeah, so this idea of these strange dislocated forms, you know, and I called the series like Devonian flesh to try and make that point between, our consumption of flesh and this material, which is, you know, so hard, and yet it's made from a sort of a biological, from biological origins. But I'm very much interested in that, using that idea of the surreal to sort of reawaken people's perceptions of something often very familiar.
Well, I find them very beautiful. This is a stunning image, this one.
Yeah, so these are me painting the rocks. And I suppose because I've worked with photography and I've taught for so long, you know, I'm so aware of the masses and zillions of photographs that there are in the world of everything you could possibly imagine. And so then as an artist, you know, you think, well, how am I going to help people see things in a fresh way, or, you know, even look for more than a second. So often we'll use time within the making of the photograph. So this is a mapped image of probably like 50 photographs where I was moving through the cave, and then I, locked them all back together to make this very, very large file. But there's a sort of a strange perspective. It's not a single perspective in the works. It does sort of twist around a multiple perspectival points, and then painting it with these, you know, really obvious colours, which are really colours that are colours that were in the rocks that I just, you know, exaggerated through through a saturation tool. And then this work, actually, I did print it up to be like 8 meters long, which was then installed in somebody's house. So, you know, trying to always sort of play with that scale. And these, you know, we've got the ideas of devices of scale and time in the making, which hopefully reflects on time in the viewing, and that idea of beauty, you know, that's like the main tool, isn't it, to sort of try to attract somebody to look at something long enough to then have some thoughts about it, or to be able to want to reside with it long enough to feel something from it. There's another work of that group there, which is another altar. These were made up in Mount Borrowdale and in East Arnhem. So I had, you know, a great opportunity to wander through some of these incredible rocky outcrops. And but, you know, I just still felt that the straight photograph didn't capture for me that sort of extraordinary and nature of what I was seeing, you know, and I think that's because of the ubiquity of photography, that everyone, and you didn't have to look far on Instagram to see 1,000 extraordinary landscapes. But I'm working, you know, because of my context, I'm working as an artist and I'm working within that history. So whenever I make a picture, I'm responding not only to those ideas, you know, the world around me, but to the history of art. After that work, I sort of drew those ideas back into the studio, and you know, and still working on this idea of trying to make intimate these sort of geological concepts. I was using my memory, in a sense, the body memory of climbing over rocks and you know, lifting them and examining them to sort of tearing up these shapes out of photographs. So I printed these sort of big, large photographs of fabric, and then tore them into these shapes, which almost came about quite naturally, I think, because of the body memory, but also because of the way the material tears. So, you know, it's always responding to those, you know, to the material you're working with, as well as to these ideas that are informing and into your bodily experiences. So, you know, the previous one was called Marmoreal, and, you know, and this one is a kind of a sedimentary collection of photographs, and thinking about, you know, how human history is sort of sedimented, and there's a lot of parallels between, you know, the sort of conglomerates and the sediments of rocks, and how things, you know, metamorphose, and to, you know, human civilization and to our own history. And photographs, you know, especially because of the massive numbers, you know, are actually forming almost a physical sediment within our lives. But that's what informed the arrangement of this work, was this kind of like just layering of this kind of sediments of history and time. And Misa, you know, and this idea of the tableland, and, you know, so you can see there's also a kind of a surreal aspect to these works. You know, there's a sort of a twist between, you know, the represented object, which is a torn piece of paper on top of other pieces of fabric and paper that are torn. So you get this kind of weird oscillation between, you know, one thing and another. And then it, you know, it's a piece of paper, it's an image, it's a photograph, you know, they sort of they're not very stable in terms of, you know, what exactly they are. And I think I'm hoping, you know, that experience when people look at artwork like this, that, you know, that inability to sort of really put your finger on something and to question, well, what is it that I'm seeing? You know, these are sort of skills or whatever that, you know, the hope that people could take out with them back into the world, so that, you know, that sort of questioning about, well, what is a photograph, and you know, how does it depict the world, what is it actually depicting, and yeah, that things aren't so stable or black and white. And then that took me on, because I'll just go through these works and we'll continue a sort of a broader conversation. But I think it's kind of important, you know, if people see, and that how I've arrived at these most recent works, which are sort of much more sculptural. And so after those torn photographs and the sort of looking at the sediments and the correlations between my experiences in geology and making photographs, I started, you know, printing the photographs onto paper and then folding them up and making not clear the image that is in the background, so that you've got these kind of multiple spaces operating on the same in the same fields. So I would put them onto metal and then crush the metal, and looking at how they could interact with their environment, you know, that they're not seen as isolated, sort of this perspective of just looking into this other world. These objects are designed to, you know, talk to their environment and to reflect, and you know, the viewer has to be very active in their, you know, being able to see it and try and make up perhaps what is the image. You know, I'm not just delivering a you know, a clear story about, you know, this is a photograph of this specific place. It becomes something much more a part of the imagination, and it really is about something becoming something, you know, but not quite. It's sort of this almost idea, but also it's really is playing off, you know, our experience of photographs and, you know, on screen, and that uploading image, which is often for a moment, unclear and blurred because it's not quite, hasn't quite arrived yet. So I'm wanting these works to talk about that sort of experience of the virtual and experience of photography through that. But, the suspended rocks are this, I hope, another type of space. So it's sort of joining up different types of temporal spaces within the same picture. The rocks are sharp. They often are, they're large rocks often that are incredibly reduced into these little pebbles. And they just kind of hang there as little sharp stones that give you something to focus on, but play with those two different types of space. So I've been having a lot of fun bending these pieces of metal, and you can see with this one, I really enjoy the sort of the shadows and sort of the interaction of their whatever environment they're in, and I'm hoping that if they go into other into other people's homes or into exhibitions, that interaction will be overt and be part of the artwork. So I suppose there's a kind of a surreal experience, in the viewing of these that you can't quite put your finger on what's going on. But it is also, it's I'm really trying to work on that idea of feeling and how an artwork can affect you from a feeling point of view rather than a kind of an intellectual point of view.
Yeah, so I'm interested in a couple of things there. I mean, you talked about beauty as a tool. As a geologist, I see lots of beauty in the natural world. For me, beauty might be not what a normal person would think. It might just be a wonderful demonstration of a geological principle in a rock, that it's really clear cut. Or it could simply just be standard beauty. But how do you incorporate that tool or concept of beauty into your work? Because I do find these very beautiful.
Well, yeah, I guess I think the aesthetic is our main tool for gaining audiences. To making these works, I've been kind of like scouring my archives and seeing which works might be able to be applied to this new condition. And in that translation, what was beautiful in one context is not beautiful in the next. And so it's always that sort of surprise of when you translate something from one situation to another, how that beauty might change or become beautiful, or it was, or the opposite. So it's a very, extremely mindful. I mean, that's the seduction of art, generally speaking. I mean, it can almost work with the anti-beautiful as well, because there's been in the history of art, there's been quite a problem with beauty. That they sort of see it as objectifying, whatever it is that is suggested to be beautiful, and so there's been quite a rejection of beauty in art, and you can see some really abject artworks that try to gain your attention through the opposite. But I'm sort of an optimist, and I'm always trying to find like solutions, put forward positive solutions rather than point out what is awful, and I think beauty is a part of that. Some people, I've read this great book on beauty and being just, and by Elaine Scarry, and she claims that our experiences of beauty, whether it be a sunset or even a beautiful person, can help us be more ethical.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Appreciate the world
Yeah.
as a
Exactly.
whole. I think the other thing that, you know, looking at your works here, which I think are absolutely wonderful, but it's the whole idea of discovery. So, you know, for me, there's this incredible sense of discovery and excitement in discovery as a geologist, you know, when you find a new rock and you think of a new concept, you know, whatever. I'm just wondering, how does that affect you, that sense of discovery? Because I can't help but feel, looking at these, that you're going through some sort of a journey of discovery here.
Oh, it's fundamental. I think I mean, one's perception gets heightened in the world, I think, as an artist, because you're constantly looking at things in new ways and putting them in different contexts and, you know, really concentrating on the aesthetic. But I think in the studio is where the real discoveries, you know, that are made, because I think we're trying to discover new ways of, obviously, of often telling the same story, but new ways that are appropriate to, you know, where we are now in time and place. And so those discoveries have to be sort of formal, you know, through the materials that we work with in response to history. I mean, it's quite similar in a way, really, isn't it? You respond to the history of science. I'm responding to the history of art. And within that, we have to make new discoveries to be part of that dialogue with history. And so that we're all contributing and commenting and, you know, adding to the knowledge base of, you know, what does it mean to be alive now?
Yeah. And I mean, for a scientist, it's the discovery is totally a drug, you know, to you know, to find something new. It's a wonderful feeling. And yeah, so
sometimes I get so excited if I feel like I've come across something new within my own work that you know, I just have to walk away from it. It's just you know, I don't know what it is, you know, it's sort of, I put it down and walk away in case I'll destroy it, or you know, and then come back and check if it is that right, have I really, you know, is it really interesting, or have I done something, you know, those moments in the studio are what I think, you know, I work for, is that sort of feeling of excitement of treading on something that is, you know, somehow unfamiliar and bright and shiny, and, you know, and exciting for me, and therefore I sort of hope that it might be exciting or interesting to somebody else. Yeah.
So I mean, the other thing that you talked about, I think one of the works, which was a mountain, or anyway, you were talking about imagining yourself climbing over it. And well, you know, when I'm out in the field, I really enjoy being out in the field collecting information, because it's very much a physical enterprise, but at the same time, it's this is really one of the characteristics of geology. You're out there being very physical, you know, can be really hard work collecting the data, but you're thinking all the time. Although sometimes we just go out and collect data and try and not think too much and come back and analyze it. So I guess my question would be, you know, is there a physicality in the way that you work? I mean, how do you combine that sense of physicality with the actual production of the work?
I mean, when you describe the idea of going out and walking and you know, hitting rocks and trying to sort of understand where that fits into, you know, time and and history, and that's, I could say that's almost exactly the same as what I would do. You know, I use that walking and climbing and time spent in the natural world as the food and, you know, nourishment for everything that comes afterwards. So there's that aspect which is, you know, really crucial to production. Then you take it back to the studio and it's, you know, you're sort of intellectualizing it, and and that's why I think in these works, you know, working with photography before is very much, you know, you have that initial sort of with camera physicality, but then it sort of becomes very flat and you can't really touch it and it goes behind a frame. Whereas these works, I can bend, I'm sort of physically, I use all of my strength, you know, to bend these pieces of metal with this sort of homemade vise system that I've made. So I've, you know, that's quite satisfying for me in terms that I can bring back that physicality back into the photo, you know, into this sort of process of, you know, making these photographic sculptures. Yeah, so the physicality is really important because, I mean, so much thinking goes on in that physical time, you know, it's a different type of thinking. You sort of think with your whole body and not just, you know, sitting with a head looking at a screen or reading words, which are extremely linear, you know, that whole body physicality, I think it really does open up, you know, a lot more wisdom, knowledge, and, you know, can bring all that experience back into it. It's a much more intuitive process.
Well, exactly. You know, it's exactly the same for us, you know, the time spent out in the field. It gives you, I mean, just the rhythm of walking, you know, it gives you that time to think, you know, to become inspired.
Exactly. I mean, it's interesting, you know, there are these parallels between art and science, and I mean, how do you, you know, you're, you know, a highly experienced geologist and, you know, and I would say an accomplished artist.
Thank you.
The work. And, you know, so how do you, you must feel the difference then between the two types of activities, or don't you, you know?
Well, I mean, I think there's many parallels, that's for sure. And I think, you know, it's a fundamental urge for human beings to try and understand the world. And, you know, the artist and the scientist are looking at the world in different ways. You know, again, you know, this idea of the language of the landscape, perhaps, and, you know, trying to reveal some deeper understanding. You know, when I look at a landscape, I'm basically trying to understand the evolution of that landscape, you know, the story of the earth. And, you know, I think, you know, people, of course, have been doing this for thousands of years, but today, you know, science has developed this method of observe, hypothesize, test, you know, which sort of codifies this method. But I don't think the artistic approach is any less important. And, you know, I think clearly it can be just, you know, we've already been talking about how exciting it can be. And I think, you know, we're emotional beings and we need to see the world in all sorts of ways. You know, if I go to a new landscape, probably my initial response is an emotional one. I'll think, oh, how beautiful that is. But then a few minutes, I'll start concentrating on the elements that interest me as a geologist, you know, the textures of the rocks or the structures of them. But ultimately, at the end of that, I'll just think, wow, that was a beautiful landscape. So ultimately, it's an emotional response.
I mean, I suppose, bringing the conversation then back to, the framework of the talk, is like how does geology and art, I had this really ambitious title about, help saving the world. Of course, the world doesn't need saving. It's just the humans and plants and animals, the earth will go on. But, how do you think, thinking about geology can, have a positive effect on, this is a question I'm just pulling out of the blue now. How do you think thinking about geology might, shift people's appreciation of, the world as an entirety and as a sort of a living organism, if we go to the Gaia principle, I've got a few ideas about that. I'd be interested to hear what you think, in terms of that.
Well, I think, geology has, obviously an enormous role to play here. Again, coming back to scale, because in recent years, since 1966, when plate tectonics, the theory of plate tectonics, or plate tectonics was discovered, let's say, because it's absolutely proven, that is that the continents are shifting around the Earth. Before that, people would look at rocks on a smaller scale, a district scale, maybe a continent scale, but not see how the big picture fits together. Now, since 1966, we understand how the Earth works. Now, it's in our life, well, at least in my lifetime. In fact, it was discovered the year or so before I went to university, so I never learned any of this. But so these exciting developments are actually now, we're able to see the world as a kind of living being, and before that, we didn't really, people guessed, but they didn't really know how it worked. I don't know if that's answering the question.
Oh no, that is, I think. And going back in history and thinking about how people understood, the material world before, there was a lot more enchantment with, within the mystery of it as well. Now we've sort of scientifically understanding that it does, that it is a closed system and that everything affects everything else. But it's interesting to think how, in terms of my own experience, how that kind of looking to something is, common as, a rock you might just trip over on the road, how that contains, it's such a fundamental building block of all the life that sort of grew up on Earth. And there's sort of, to separate the inanimate, or which I think rocks are animate really, and the way they move around, but the inhuman, or the biological and the mineral, it seems like an arbitrary line to draw, because once we understand this, the way that everything affects everything else, you can't really draw the line at rocks, and say, well, they're just a resource for us to sort of use up, and because they, I think in sort of spirit, they have this, deep connection with us, historically, and with all life on Earth, so it sort of gets to be sort of almost a spiritual position, about how to think about, our connectedness to everything, not just the living, not just sort of the biological, but, to that sort of porosity between, the living and the non-living, rocks and the biology. I just think that opens out a deeper kind of appreciation and understanding, and it plays back to this idea of, that we believe that we have sovereignty over Earth, over all of its resources. But, if we bring back perhaps more Indigenous ideas about, mountains and rocks and rivers having, spirit, we may behave, quite differently and which is so wonderful that we can learn from those histories and cultures today. But, that's how it's kind of shifted my thinking, really.
I think, well, I think you've said it pretty well. I'm not sure what to add there, but
it's a tricky thing, they're tricky things to talk about, and that's why I make pictures, really, is to create alternative forms to to words, really, to sort of, and that's also why I think that's why it's great having conversation, why art and science should not be separate, so separate. All our education systems have kind of separated them. If we had more overlap, there would be more kind of fellowship and more feeding and understanding, and of course we need everybody working on these ideas, especially now with the world in such a terrible state. But maybe, if Michelle's there, maybe we might open it up if there are any other questions from any questions from the people or from yourself, Michelle.
Thank you, Marion. That was really wonderful, absolutely fascinating. And I'm sorry I turned the video off. I was actually making a cup of tea while I listened. There are a couple of comments, just people saying this is very beautiful. What do we, some private questions that other folks can't see, which I might come to. But one of the first questions is from Moretta. Hello, Moretta. And she's asking what the title of the book was, Marion, about beauty.
Oh, Beauty and Being Just.
Beauty and who was it by?
Elaine Scarry, S-C-A-R-R-Y.
S-C-A-R-R-Y?
Yeah.
Kind of like scary, but two
R's.
Yeah,
but scary, yeah.
Right. I've just put that reference in. Actually, that was one of the questions. Some questions come that everyone can see, others, whether they mean to or not, come to me personally. One question was, can you talk more about why being exposed to beauty makes us more ethical? Because this seems to fly in the face of some ideas about modern interpretations of, iconic beauty in Hollywood stars versus you're talking about something much deeper, aren't you?
Yeah. Well, I mean, Scarry had a few arguments that she puts sort of much more beautifully than I could, but it's a sort of about comparisons. It's about learning that you can be wrong is one of them. That what you thought was beautiful then is no longer beautiful. And in that experience of being wrong, you learn that you could be wrong about other things as well. It's also, I mean, I'm summarizing these terribly, and I recommend the book, but it's also it's gone out of my head. The idea that we want to, when you see something beautiful, you're kind of compelled to share it. And I think we can all relate to that because, you see a sunset, you really want somebody there next to you to sort of have a look at it as well, or a beetle or a blue winged bee, so beauty sort of compels us to share it. And, that's why we make art. And, and I think that sharing, I think, it's a sort of, there's an egalitarianism in that sharing, and that sort of creating of, an equal situation. It doesn't matter if you're a king or a pauper, you can, you're still experiencing the same kind of beauty. And I think within that, there is the opportunity for a sort of an ethical opening out and an ethical awareness anyway. It's sort of more like an awareness. But I do recommend the book.
Yeah, thank you, Marian. It sounds excellent. A quick question for Clive. Someone's asked, they were surprised that plate tectonics was such a new discovery, you know, in terms of human knowledge. What did people think before they understood the movement of plate tectonics?
Well, the idea that the continents moved actually came about around about 1912, thereabouts, by a man called Wegener in Europe, but nobody believed him. I mean, even if you just look at the globe of the Earth and look at the way that South America and Africa can be pulled together and seem to fit, people had recognized that, but the trouble was there was no mechanism to, now I'm sort of, this is not much about art, but anyway, I think it's interesting. But there was no mechanism to explain it. After the Second World War and the US military were developing submarine technology, they decided to map the seafloor and make magnetic maps of the seafloor. And lo and behold, they discovered that there were all these stripes in the bed of the Atlantic Ocean. And they realized that the Atlantic Ocean had been moving, expanding, which helped to explain how the continents were shifting. And eventually they developed the idea by 1966 exactly how it all, that Wegener was right after all, and suddenly everybody was on board. But yes, so when I was at university, I learned nothing about this. I had to teach myself because it was all too new. There was whispers in the corridors.
Oh my gosh, was it like radical whispers about?
Well, it was
geology?
radical, this new idea. But the thing was that it transformed geology from kind of an observational science where you just go out and make sketches and describe things. There was an awful lot of description of stuff into a real science where we now we knew how the world worked. It's profound.
I think it's profound. I remember reading a book about the 5 big ideas that have been key to science. And it's always funny. The one I always remember is the discovery or the recognition of tectonic plates. So thank you, Clive. Honey has some questions. She says, can I ask Clive and Marian about the imagery that they may have seen in rocks around Australia? I guess she means what you've seen in the rocks, images, or... Do you want to talk a little bit about whatever you've seen? Then there's another question for Clive, but we'll come back to that.
Clive, you want to go first?
Well, look, I'm a structural geologist, which, I'm a general geologist, but I know quite a lot about structure, which is dealing with the shapes in rocks and the way rocks are folded. And often you see absolutely stunning lines in rocks. And actually, it brings me to the idea of the whole concept of order and disorder, which was something I was going to bring up. But and a lot of these lines that you see in rocks, you just think, oh, well, they're just random lines, but actually they're not, and I think there's actually more order in nature than disorder. And so that, to me, a lot of the patterns and textures you see in rocks, they have a meaning if you only know how to read them.
They're like a library.
Can I ask about that?
Yes.
Am I able to ask about that? Yeah,
yes, go for it, honey. Yeah.
Thank you. Both of you have been, as I have, all over Australia. I've explored a lot of Australia, and particularly with a delight in geology, a wonderful ignorant delight. But including right into the great abyssal gorges of the Pilbara, which gosh, Clive, we must be witnessing 4 billion years anyway down there. It's just incredible. But I also, everywhere I've carted my camera around, and I have got hundreds of magnificent images, perhaps because there's so much, the ancient seabed is so tightly layered, and as it weathers, the surfaces can form patterns. And I have got some extraordinary imagery of eyes and creatures and pathways and dancing women and footprints and animals and a rocket being launched, and just an incredible array of very graphic pictures, and including even from the south coast on New South Wales. The terraces form the most wonderful pictures, and it feels like this kind of nexus between what you're talking about, the sort of the living earth and beauty and expression. Some of them are quite pointed imagery, particularly some of the eyes and stuff. Anyway, I wondered if you had seen and photographed any of these graphic marvels that you can find if you've got your eyes open looking around Australian geology.
Thanks, honey. And I guess sometimes it's like the ink blots, isn't it? If we see what we're thinking or I see animals and plants in everything, but someone else might see people in everything. What do you find, Marion?
Oh, yeah, I think, it can change day by day too. And I think that imagination, is so crucial in terms of, in appreciating and I think we're always trying to find meaning in things. I do feel like, that. So when these things speak to us as images, we're associating, obviously, one thing with another, and and it sounds like it's really evoking, an imaginative world, and as you say, I think that there's an ink blot kind of an association that, depending on what nightmares or dreams you have, they can appear as well, but it also, and then it changes then with what and I'm, so I'm imagining Clive would be reading those lines as, infusions of, of water over time, or, his knowledge would then change the reading. And
yeah, I do wonder about that, Marion and Clive. Simply because I have this vivid memory of driving in Ireland with a friend, and she's a geologist. And I looked up at this kind of, I would just call it an escarpment or a cliff. And I said, wow, that looks like a giant loaf of sliced bread. Yeah. And one of the little bits has fallen over. And she kind of looked at me almost with disdain, and she went, well, that's blah, 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 blah. I went, oh, still looks like a loaf of bread.
Yeah.
So Clive, how do you balance that? Not so much a need, but a trained capacity to analyze a name versus that imaginative. Do they sit nicely together for you? You don't have too much trouble?
Yeah, well, I think initially when I graduated from university, I was kind of disturbed in a way. I felt I couldn't look at the landscape just for its beauty, but I think I got over that. And I think now, like I said before, my initial response now is just to have an emotional response and enjoy the landscape. So I think I've moved on from that. But yeah, look, it's dangerous to travel with a geologist. You get lots of lessons.
Yes, they can take away from your giant loaves of bread, but they can tell you many good things as well. And speaking of telling us many good things, I mean, the topic of today's talk is how understanding rocks can save the world. And Marion and Clive, with your passion for rocks, can you talk just a little bit, because I think we're meant to wrap up around 1:15, so we'll start to wrap up soon. But can you talk just a little bit about how this deep understanding of the geology, the very foundations of life, the biosphere, how can that help us think differently or understand the scale of time and save the world?
Yeah, well, I think, I mean, in a purely scientific sense, there's so many modern studies in geology, looking at the long-term changes in climate, like looking at lake sediments, So we can now go back several million years in quite a lot of detail to work out how the climate has changed. Of course, we can go back even further than that, but and then the allied science of glaciology, where they're looking at drilling through ice in Antarctica and getting information, you know, year by year, actually. So in terms of the effect that we're having on the climate, you know, a lot of the modern geological studies are really telling us a lot and putting the present day into context. You know, we're seeing, you know, how, I mean, many years ago, of course, people didn't think that humans could have a big effect on the world. Well, we now know they can, and we can see this in the geological record. Yeah. So I realise we're running out of time.
Yeah.
So
No, that's okay. Marion, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it can evoke curiosity, you know, that no, you know, I mean, apart from the scientific and being informed by the scientific and knowing that urgency, which, you know, is incredibly important, which is what's moving people, so many people today. I think even on a personal level, on an artistic level, if thinking about rocks and, you know, can evoke that deep sense of curiosity about everything, you know, about the world in which we live, right down to the fundamental, to get away from, you know, consumer objects and man-made things, and to look at these fundamental building blocks, I think that shift can, you know, can play out through so many other aspects of our lives. And I just think it's really grounding and yeah, so just fundamental. It's going back deeply to fundamentals and to think about us as a species in this big time on Earth, you know, and that it could all be over if we don't act.
Thank you. And it's a good time to share a comment from Richard has said, as a foresight practitioner, I've found that opening to the study of deep time does have a number of useful, even powerful implications. And he's referred to a short piece that was published earlier this year, Deep Time Futures Compass. So thank you for sharing that, Richard. And just one final interesting comment from Neil. It's probably for Clive, perhaps. Following on from tectonics, is there another geological theory waiting to be validated? What's lurking in the wings, Clive, for next phase of our understanding?
Well, you know, geology has really branched out into so many different sub-disciplines. People, you know, like I got interested in granites recently, and I realised that we don't fully understand, you know, some aspects of granites, and I can't think of anything quite as profound as plate tectonics. So I think, you know, that's really the big one, and I doubt whether we'll have another one like that in a long time. But there's many fascinating discoveries being made all the time.
Excellent. All right. Well, look, this has been a fascinating discovery. An artist and a geologist having a yarn about the joy of rocks. And Marion, I must commend you. I could have a whole conversation with you about the technical skill required to make those images you've made. I kind of scratch my head at just being able to get a photo with an iPhone occasionally look okay. So the technical aspects of that might have to wait for a whole nother conversation. But there's a number of folks now saying, thank you so much for sharing your work with us. It's very inspiring, and I agree. It's been a lovely chat. Thank you so much for sharing your work and your thoughts with us, and for being part of Earth Laws Month. And we're going to see Marion again on Thursday when we have our 1 hour launch of the Earthwords anthology. We're going to drag Marion into having a yarn about the Earth Arts Collective and things like that. And Clive, now that you're in the Ayla family, we will draw on you again, no doubt. We'll see you soon, I hope. So thank you, everyone, for being part of our chat today. And yeah, we've given you their website, so do look in the chat. We've given you Clive's YouTube channel. and Marion's website. So do have a look. And they're actually also listed on the Humanitics event booking page. So thank you again for your time. Really enjoyed the discussion and the beautiful images. We'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.